So Nintendo showed us something with the Switch Lite. They showed us that Nintendo is going to Nintendo, as in, we don't really ever know what they're actually going to come up with. Sure, a handheld-only Switch just for the pricing makes sense, but does it? Because the Switch can't technically switch when it's a Switch Lite, right? That's kind of where we are now with Nintendo. The Switch is a brand. It's a family of devices. Not necessarily that it has to make sense that this is a Switch, but it doesn't switch. It's the Switch Lite. It's part of the Switch family underneath the Switch umbrella, whereas the regular OG Switch does switch. We're on the same page here, right? It's interesting with Nintendo sometimes, but when I opened up the Switch Lite, I did notice something, and that was that it's using the standard InnoLux display. And I posted that on Twitter, and people didn't really seem to understand what that necessarily meant at the time, but what it means is, while Wall Street Journal has been correct about several things with Nintendo's strategy so far, specifically, well, the models coming out, the revision and the Switch Lite, they talked about the Switch Lite heavily, but they also talked about another system, and they did say that the devices wouldn't necessarily be what we think they would be, right? They said it might not be how you would expect. Well, the Switch Lite turned out kind of how we expected. It doesn't dock, but it's basically a Vita successor, right? I mean, it's $200, which I think is a good price for it, and it's a very good handheld experience. Really, it's a solid system. I really like it. But that leaves the question, what about the other system they were talking about? Because while we got that revision, we didn't get the one that seems to be geared towards gamers, as they say, or enthusiast gamers, as they described it. So that kind of leaves the question, what is going on going forward with Nintendo? And is there another system actually coming? Now, it's Saturday, okay, and I'll probably just put this under rumor wave or something. It's basically speculation. It's fun speculation to look back on years from now, right? Now, I remember leading up to the Switch Lite's announcement, we had talked, because there were rumors going around about there being a Switch Lite that would not dock. There were conflicting reports. People didn't think it was possible. It wouldn't make any sense. And then the Switch Lite comes out and it does not dock. So what that tells me is, while we may have perception as to what the next revision could be, because again, the Wall Street Journal has described it being more revisions coming at some point in time, it's not necessarily what we would expect it to be. So I figured we could talk a little bit about some of the ideas and just some different things with what Wall Street Journal has described. And what about those IGZO screens? Because that's something I'm a bit confused about as well. So as far back as March of this year, the Wall Street Journal had been describing new screens being used in the Switch revision and the Switch Lite. But that never happened. They stuck with InnoLux, and even Sharp executives themselves said that they were going to be providing IGZO screens to Nintendo for their devices. And they didn't really say the Switch system. They just said they were going to be providing them to Nintendo for something. That's all we really know. And the IGZO screens are used in high-end cell phones. For example, the Razer 2, I believe, uses it. There are also laptops that use them. They're more expensive screens, but they have a lot of benefits to them with higher refresh rate. I believe the Razer 2, for example, the Razer Phone 2 has 120 hertz refresh rate, which is very, very responsive. And I've thought about this more and more with Nintendo going into the next generation, because we've almost completed 3 years. That's in March, right? We'll have completed 3 years of the Switch. And generally with the device, that is right around half, I would say, right, of its lifespan on the market before we start talking about the next system, you know? I've thought about this, and something that keeps coming up is Nintendo, rather than doing the resolution wars and chasing 8K and everything, maybe they could be the ones that push high frame rate and market as something similar to what they did with their more accurate rumble motors and called them HD Rumble. Maybe they could chase the frame rate, you know, and the frame rate war, 120 frames per second or 120 hertz, and call it something crazy like True Motion, or I don't know. They'll call it something weird and get away with it, and we'll be like, wow, look at that. It's Nintendo coining a phrase for something that's been around for a while, but not necessarily with systems. And that's something that the IGZO displays would be able to help with in a handheld device. But would it make sense for now? That's my biggest question here, and the biggest part of the speculation for me is, are we sure the IGZO displays are for a Switch Pro that would be coming this generation? Are we sure that Sharp isn't talking about how they are in plans with Nintendo to possibly provide IGZO screens for the next generation Switch? That's something that keeps coming up, because the Wall Street Journal was pretty sure that those IGZO screens were going to be used this year. It's not in the Lite. It's not in the revision. Would it really be in the Switch Pro? Because I have a strong feeling that the IGZO display would probably go to waste in the Switch Pro. Sure, it would look better. It would be more efficient with batteries and everything, but wouldn't it be better to really push it and get a high frame rate out of it for the next Switch? You take even backwards compatible games like Mario Odyssey with a patch, and all of a sudden it could touch 120 frames per second on a newer device, right? That'd be pretty neat. So I'm not really sure if the IGZO display even makes sense for this current Switch now, and that could be something that they're planning for the next generation. See, because I don't believe that Nintendo wants to leave it at the Switch Lite and just the regular Switch. I think they want to continue introducing more and more devices going forward until they eventually, I would say, probably start discontinuing some for current projects and going into a new generation. I think Nintendo will still stick with a new generation, but I think there will just be way more devices that come out. And honestly, Nintendo does revisions constantly, so that's not super surprising to hear about that. I guess with their home consoles it is, but with their handheld line, it was pretty much expected to have something new come out. I mean, I remember, when the new 2DS XL got announced, no one saw that coming. No one even expected it, and then they dropped it online, and everyone out and bought it when it came out because it's Nintendo and it's a handheld revision. So I almost feel like you just never know with Nintendo. So I want to go a little out there. Okay, just stick with me here. I promise I'm not giving you any clues. This isn't anything. I'm not trying to feed you a hidden message here. This is just speculation and something to come back to years from now just to see if it held any water. And hey, maybe I got something right. I don't know. I think there is a possibility, okay, I'm going to say this possibility, that Nintendo may have plans for something that doesn't use a screen. And the reason I say that is because if they want to really push things and work towards a device that might just be for the home, I think they could do it in a more cost-effective manner by eliminating a lot of the things that make the Switch its form factor as it is now, with the screen and one, body basically that you carry around. If it was a bit more like the NVIDIA Shield TV, they could probably keep it at a cost-effective measure and be able to play around with the internals to get a stronger chipset and, better cooling. So they could push clock speeds, and they might be able to come up with something that is, as the Wall Street Journal has said, something we wouldn't expect, that would be for the enthusiast gamer. And before you say that's not possible, did you also think that the Switch Lite had to dock? Because it doesn't. That's something that I've thought about. If the Switch Pro were real, because I'm not even 100% sure if that's even a thing. Look, I can talk about the Switch Lite being a thing because it makes sense from a cost measure to replace the 3DS. I think there's still wiggle room. I think the Switch Lite could eventually be 170 or 180 without too much issue, and then it is a straight replacement for the new 3DS XL. I think that makes sense. I can justify that easily in the market. The Switch Pro is a bit harder, because something I've noticed with Nintendo is they could have made this dock. I don't think it was necessarily a cost-saving measure to make this thing not dock, even just giving it the ability, because the chip that was removed and some of the stuff in here that was removed doesn't really cost that much. I've checked into it. It really wasn't that big of a deal to remove it. The firmware's already set up for it, right? And they could have just said, hey, you know what? This is what it is. If you want to dock it, you got to buy this accessory. Oh, and look at that. They've now upsold you on what is probably a $50 accessory, but they didn't do that. And I think that has to do with each device having its own place in the market. I think the Switch Lite makes sense at its price point and its form factor for a younger audience, or hey, maybe just people who don't want to have to haul their Switch with Joy-Cons around and they want something that is a bit more portable. The Switch Hybrid makes sense for somebody who wants both worlds. And a consoleized Switch could also make sense for someone who doesn't want to take it out of the dock, because Nintendo's done surveys. They've looked into this. I feel like they wouldn't mind having another device on the market that can be separated from these two. Possibly a console? It's just something to think about. I'm not saying it's happening, but I'm not saying it's impossible either. I also thought about the possibility of Nintendo attacking that sub $100 mark or that $100 mark where the 2DS currently resides, and if they did make basically a PlayStation Vita TV for the Switch, now that would really attack that lower end market, and it wouldn't necessarily be the Pro. See, if there is a Pro, okay, maybe they are going to use an IGZO display. Let's say they are going to do that. It's due out next year or something, and it's going to help to bridge the gap to the next generation. They've used better screens and devices before, like the Game Boy Advance SP, and eventually we got a screen like that in the DS Lite. So yeah, that's possible. So what if they took the Switch and did make their own NVIDIA Shield TV, but they cut costs and made it literally like a $99 box that you buy? That would also attack the lower end market and could make sense for install size as well. Some people said it was impossible for a Switch to come out that can't switch because it makes no sense because it's a Switch. But here it is. So what if the Switch Pro, again, just food for thought, isn't necessarily a Switch? What if it's just a box like the NVIDIA Shield TV? Something to think about. I'm also curious where those IGZO screens would come into play if it was for the Switch Pro. Let's say the Switch Pro was a hybrid system. How would they get that cheap enough? Because IGZO screens are not inexpensive. They are very expensive. They're a luxury screen, okay? And if you're going to use it, you should probably use it in a fashion that it would you get the most out of it. You'd want the higher refresh rate and everything out of it. You know, you'd want the deep colors, the energy saving parts of it. I feel like you would design an entire system around using it rather than putting it into an ecosystem that you have to develop for the lowest end system. If you make a system that could have an IGZO display, you're probably not going to get the most out of it. So I feel like you save that for the next generation and you build around it and you work with what you have now with the InnoLux display. Either way, the IGZO screen was never used this year, despite seemingly the Wall Street Journal being very, very sure of that. They're right about everything else, but not the IGZO screen. So it just makes me wonder, if the Switch Pro does eventually happen, does it necessarily have to be a device that has a screen? I don't know. Something to think about. Let me know what you guys think down below, because I don't even know if there will ever be a Switch Pro. I think it's also very possible Nintendo could tough it out for the next 3 years and then just jump to the next generation. They have the support now. I think Breath of the Wild 2 could be next holiday. I think Metroid Prime could be the following holiday after that, and then they'll sprinkle in some other first parties and some different third parties in there. But Nintendo wants to attack this from an install size, okay? That's how they want to do this to compete with the stronger systems that are coming in 2020. And that's a good strategy, because if you have 80 to 90 million systems on the market, well, yeah, guess what? Third parties are going to develop for it no matter what it is. But thanks, guys, for watching. Like I said, I'm curious what your thoughts are down below. Make sure you leave a like if you enjoyed the video on the way out, and I'll see you guys next time.